Millionaire CEO walked into a cafe. Then a little boy ran to his ex and called her mom. He froze. Chris Turcotte stepped into the cafe without meaning to. He noticed the bell above the door first, soft, almost polite. It rang once, then stopped. The sound felt smaller than the world he'd come from that morning. No urgency followed it. No one rushed to respond. He adjusted his coat and lifted his eyes. That was when he saw her. Tatiana Shields sat near the window, angled slightly toward the light, her posture relaxed in a way that made time feel optional. She was smiling at someone across the table, not carefully, not politely, but with ease, the kind of smile that didn't need approval or permission. Chris stopped walking. It had been years, enough years that he'd learned how not to think of her, enough years that her absence had become normal. Yet the moment his eyes found her, the distance collapsed. She hadn't disappeared after all. She was right there. For a moment, Chris remained where he was, half inside the doorway, half caught somewhere else entirely. Outside, his morning had been stacked with urgency, calls that overlapped, messages waiting for answers, decisions that refused delay. His days usually moved in straight lines, measured by outcomes and deadlines. Every step forward carried weight. Inside the cafe, none of that mattered. People spoke softly, if at all. Cups rested on tables longer than necessary. A woman near the counter laughed without checking her phone. No one seemed concerned about being anywhere else. The contrast unsettled him. This place wasn't demanding anything from him. It wasn't asking for attention, speed, or control. It simply existed, steady and unbothered. And at the center of that calm sat Tatiana, comfortable, present, exactly where she was meant to be. Chris felt it then, the quiet discomfort of realizing how far his life had drifted from moments like this. The word reached him before the meaning did. Mom. It cut cleanly through the low murmur of the cafe, clear, bright, certain. Chris didn't react at first. His mind was still fixed on Tatiana, on the strange feeling of seeing someone who belonged to another chapter of his life sitting comfortably in the present. Then the sound settled. Mom. His attention snapped toward the voice just as movement crossed his peripheral vision. Small footsteps, quick, unrestrained, the kind that didn't hesitate or ask permission. Chris's breath caught, not from what he saw yet, but from what the word implied. Tatiana had never been a mother when he knew her. The realization landed softly, then all at once. The boy crossed the room without slowing. His shoes tapped lightly against the floor as he moved with complete confidence, weaving past chairs and tables like he knew exactly where he was going. There was no hesitation in him, no doubt. He reached Tatiana and wrapped his arms around her waist. She laughed, soft, natural, and lowered herself immediately, as if this moment had happened 100 times before. One hand smoothed his hair back, the other steadying him as he pressed closer. I told you not to run, she said, the words gentle, almost amused. The boy grinned up at her, unconcerned. He held out a folded sheet of paper, proud and expectant. Chris watched the exchange in silence. It wasn't dramatic. That was what made it heavy. There was history in the way she touched him. Routine, care that didn't need thinking. Whatever this was, it wasn't new. Chris didn't move, not forward, not back, not even enough to pretend he was still deciding what to order. Something tightened in his chest, sudden and unfamiliar. His body reacted before his thoughts could catch up, like it recognized a truth his mind wasn't ready to face. This wasn't a coincidence he could ignore. This wasn't a harmless encounter. Tatiana wasn't just passing through his life anymore. She was rooted somewhere else now, and he was standing at the edge of it, uninvited, unsure, and very aware of how much had changed without him. Chris stayed where he was, watching a life that no longer waited for him. There was no anger in the moment, no accusation, just a quiet certainty that he was looking at something complete, something that had learned how to exist without his presence. It raised a question he hadn't prepared for. Not just about Tatiana, about himself. What do you do when the future you once discussed shows up, already lived by someone else? What do you do when the door you walked past years ago is no longer standing open, yet you can still see the light inside? The question lingered, unanswered, as Chris finally took a step forward. Chris had built a life that looked complete from the outside, the titles, the authority, the certainty that came with being listened to and relied on. He had learned how to move forward without looking back, how to measure progress in results instead of moments. But standing there watching Tatiana lean toward the boy, listening to her laugh settle naturally into the space between them, something became clear. Success hadn't erased what he left behind. It had only delayed the moment when it would stand in front of him again. This wasn't about jealousy or regret. It was about collision, between who he had become and what he had once let go of, between a life built on momentum and one built on presence. And for the first time in years, Chris didn't know which mattered more. Chris had always believed timing decided everything. You moved when the window opened. You committed when the moment was right. You kept going when hesitation threatened progress. That belief had guided every major choice he'd made, yet here he was, standing in a place he hadn't planned to enter, facing a moment he hadn't prepared for. Tatiana hadn't waited for him to return. Life hadn't paused for him to catch up. And still, something inside him asked a quiet, dangerous question. Not whether he could reclaim what was gone, not whether he deserved another chance, but whether a different choice, made now, could still matter. The question didn't demand an answer yet. It simply refused to leave. Before the moment could slip past him, before he could retreat into habit and distance, the story pauses just long enough to let you step inside it too. Whether you're here for the first time, or you've been listening along for a while, this is a story about timing, choices, and the quiet moments that change direction without warning. Stories like this don't rush. They don't shout. They unfold the way real life does, one decision at a time. Settle in. If stories like this speak to you, take a moment to show your support. Like the video so more people can find it. Subscribe to Mr. Cooper Stories and stay with us, because what unfolds from here isn't about grand gestures. It's about the choices that come quietly, and the lives they change. Chris remained near the entrance longer than necessary, pretending to study the menu mounted above the counter. The truth was simpler. He needed a moment to steady himself. From where he stood, he could see Tatiana clearly. She sat with an ease that hadn't existed in the years they shared. Back then, there had always been a trace of waiting in her posture, a quiet readiness to adjust her time around. That tension was gone now. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her attention rested fully on the boy beside her. She listened when he spoke, not halfway, not with the polite patience people offer children. She listened as though nothing else deserved space in that moment. Chris noticed the small details, the way she nodded, the slight smile that appeared before the boy even finished his sentence, the calm certainty in her movements. None of it looked practiced. It looked lived in. This wasn't a role she was trying on. It was a life she had settled into. And as Chris watched her, something became clear in a way that didn't need words. She wasn't missing anything anymore. The cafe held its own rhythm. A cup was set down behind the counter. Someone stirred sugar slowly, unhurried. Chairs shifted with soft sounds that never demanded attention. Nothing here seemed pressed for time. Chris felt out of place in it. His instincts told him to move, to order, to occupy his hands, to give the moment a purpose that could be measured. Stillness had never been something he trusted. In his world, pauses were gaps waiting to be filled. Here, the pause stood on its own. He became aware of how tense his shoulders were, how shallow his breathing had grown. The calm around him didn't soothe him at first. It exposed him. It made the weight he carried more noticeable, not less. And through it all, Tatiana remained steady. She fit the room without effort, like someone who had learned how to slow down without losing herself. Watching her, Chris felt the uncomfortable distance between the pace he lived by and the pace unfolding in front of him. For the first time that morning, he wondered what it would feel like to stay still long enough to belong somewhere like this. The boy's voice drifted back into Chris's awareness before he realized he was listening. It wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding. It carried the simple certainty of someone who expected to be heard. He stood beside Tatiana now, balancing on his toes as he spoke, his hands moving freely as if the story mattered more than the words used to tell it. Whatever he was explaining, it held his full attention, and hers. Tatiana leaned slightly toward him, eyes focused, expression open. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush him along. She let him finish at his own pace. Chris noticed how naturally the boy filled the space beside her. There was no hesitation in him, no sense of needing permission to be close. He belonged there in a way that couldn't be rehearsed. Chris looked away briefly, then back again, as if expecting the scene to change. It didn't. Chris watched long enough to recognize the pattern. The boy reached for his cup without looking. Tatiana slid it slightly out of reach before it tipped, her movements smooth and automatic. He didn't protest. He simply adjusted and kept talking. Neither of them acknowledged the exchange. That was what caught Chris's attention most. These were not careful moments. They were practiced ones, the kind that form when two lives share space every day, when correction and care blend together without effort. Tatiana smiled at something the boy said, not wide, not performative, just enough to let him know she was with him. He seemed satisfied by that alone. Chris felt the weight of what he was witnessing settle slowly. This wasn't affection squeezed into spare time. This was routine, structure, presence repeated until it became invisible. And standing there, Chris understood something without needing it explained. This life hadn't been built in a rush. The boy noticed him suddenly, not with suspicion, not with curiosity sharpened by caution, just a straightforward glance, quick and open, as if Chris had always been there and was only now worth greeting. He tilted his head, studying Chris for a second longer than politeness required. Then he smiled. It wasn't wide or performative. It was small, satisfied, like a decision made and settled. Chris felt the shift immediately. Being seen had a way of changing the shape of a moment. He straightened slightly, unsure whether to return the smile or look away. The boy didn't wait for either. He turned back to Tatiana and continued talking, as if Chris's presence had already been accounted for and dismissed as harmless. That ease stayed with Chris. There was no guarding here, no sense of measuring him, just a quiet assumption that he belonged in the room as much as anyone else, and for reasons he couldn't explain that unsettled him more than distance ever could. Tatiana sensed him before she looked up. It showed in the smallest pause, barely a breath, before her attention shifted. When her eyes met his, there was no surprise in them. No tension, no guardedness, just recognition. "Chris," she said. His name landed gently, spoken the way one speaks something familiar without needing to test it. "Tatiana," he replied, his voice lower than he intended. Nothing else followed, no explanations, no catching up compressed into nervous words. The space between them held steady, neither inviting nor rejecting. The boy glanced from her to Chris, then back again, as if connecting pieces without urgency. Tatiana rested a hand lightly on the table, grounding herself. She didn't move away from the boy. She didn't shift toward Chris either. She stayed exactly where she was. And in that stillness, Chris felt the truth of it. She wasn't bracing for him anymore. Whatever history they shared no longer dictated how she stood in the present. She had learned how to meet him without losing herself. The boy broke the quiet without hesitation. He looked at Chris again, this time with more focus, as if curiosity had finally caught up with him. "Who's he?" he asked, his voice clear and uncomplicated. There was no challenge in it, no caution, just a question that expected an answer. Tatiana didn't rush to fill the space. That pause, brief but noticeable, caught Chris's attention. It wasn't uncertainty, it was consideration. She glanced at him once, then back to the boy. "An old friend," she said. The words were simple, chosen carefully. They carried history without opening it. Chris felt their weight settle, not sharply, but firmly. The label didn't push him away, yet it didn't pull him closer either. It placed him exactly where he belonged in that moment, acknowledged but not centered. The boy nodded, accepting the answer without further thought. Chris realized then that this wasn't his story to define anymore. He could only step into the space offered to him, nothing more. And strangely, that felt honest. The boy studied Chris again, this time with purpose. He looked from Chris to the empty chair beside the table, then back up, as if the solution to something had just presented itself. "You can sit here," he said, already reaching for the chair and pulling it out slightly. There was no hesitation in the offer, no glance toward Tatiana for approval. To him, the decision felt obvious. Chris blinked. The invitation caught him off guard, not because it was bold, but because it was unguarded. It carried no expectation beyond presence, no past, no evaluation. Tatiana's eyes flicked to the chair, then to Chris. She didn't speak. She didn't correct the boy or rush to soften the moment. She waited. The room seemed to narrow to that small space between them. The chair, the table, the choice. Chris placed a hand on the back of the chair, feeling the worn wood beneath his fingers. For the first time since walking in, he was being asked to stay. Chris didn't answer right away. He glanced once toward the counter, then back to the chair, as if confirming there was nowhere else he needed to be. No call pulling at him, no obligation demanding movement. He pulled the chair out and sat. The motion was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried weight. The scrape of wood against the floor sounded louder to him than it should have, marking a decision he hadn't planned to make. The boy smiled, satisfied, and returned to his seat without ceremony. Tatiana shifted slightly to make room, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge Chris's presence. No one spoke for a moment. Chris rested his hands on the table, feeling the steady surface beneath his palms. He wasn't observing anymore. He was part of the scene now, however loosely. And with that, something subtle changed. He hadn't explained himself. He hadn't asked permission. He had simply stayed. The cafe returned to its rhythm around them. A cup was placed on a nearby table. Someone laughed softly near the window. Life continued without acknowledging the quiet weight of what had just happened. Chris listened as the boy resumed talking, his voice steady, his words spilling out without concern for order. Tatiana responded easily, her attention moving between the boy and the moment in front of her, never strained, never divided. No one asked Chris why he was there. No one questioned how long he would stay. And that was when it settled. This wasn't an interruption. It wasn't a confrontation. It was an opening. Chris realized he hadn't been invited back into the past. He had been allowed into the present, one small choice at a time. The chair beneath him felt solid. The table grounded him. The space no longer felt borrowed. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He was already here. Chris didn't remember the exact moment when things between them had started to shift. There hadn't been a single argument or a clear breaking point, no dramatic scene he could replay and blame. The change had arrived quietly, the way distance often does, slow enough to ignore, steady enough to matter. Back then, his days were already filling up. Meetings stretched later, calls replaced dinners, plans were postponed, then forgotten. Each decision felt reasonable on its own, small enough not to question. Tatiana had been there through it all, not standing in his way, not demanding explanations, just adjusting at first, believing that patience would be rewarded, that the pace would eventually slow. It never did, and without either of them naming it, the space between them began to grow. They met during a season when everything still felt possible. Chris was driven even then, but the weight of responsibility hadn't settled on him yet. His ambition was sharp, focused, but it hadn't learned how to crowd out the rest of his life. He spoke about ideas more than outcomes, plans more than control. Tatiana noticed that first. She was grounded in a way that didn't compete with his energy. Where he pushed forward, she steadied. Where he imagined, she listened. Their conversations stretched easily, unmeasured by time, filled with questions instead of conclusions. They met often at places like the Café, quiet spaces where nothing demanded urgency. They talked about work, about where they wanted to be, about what kind of life felt worth building. At that point, none of it felt rushed. They believed there would always be time. In the beginning, being together felt easy. They didn't need elaborate plans to enjoy each other's time. Long conversations happened without effort, sometimes over dinner that went cold, sometimes during late walks where neither of them noticed how much time had passed. Chris talked about the future with certainty, not arrogance, just belief. He described the kind of company he wanted to build, the impact he hoped to make, the life he imagined once everything was stable. Tatiana listened without trying to reshape his vision. She asked questions that slowed him just enough to think deeper, not faster. When he spoke about success, she spoke about balance, about having something real to come home to when the work was done. They talked about a home that felt calm, about weekends that belonged to them, about a life that wasn't only defined by achievement. Back then, those ideas didn't compete. They fit together. The change didn't arrive all at once. At first, it looked like opportunity, a new project that needed extra hours, a client who required late calls, a trip that couldn't be postponed. Each request felt justified, even necessary. Chris told himself it was temporary, just a short stretch of pressure before things settled. They didn't settle. Weeks filled faster than expected. Evenings became extensions of the workday. Messages replaced conversations that used to happen face to face. Chris stayed focused, convinced that pushing harder now would create more freedom later. From his side, the logic made sense. From Tatiana's side, the silence grew. She didn't interrupt his momentum. She adjusted her schedule, filled her time, waited for the pace to ease the way he said it would. But the more his world expanded, the less space remained for the quiet routines they once shared. Nothing had broken yet, but something important had begun to thin. At first, Tatiana believed the pressure would pass. Chris had always spoken about phases, busy seasons followed by calmer ones. She trusted that this was just another stretch that required patience. When he canceled dinner, she didn't argue. When meetings ran late, she told him to focus and finish what he'd started. She wasn't keeping score. She still saved him a seat when she cooked, still sent short messages asking if he'd eaten, still left space in her evenings in case he finished early. It wasn't sacrifice in her mind. It was investment. She believed that once the pace slowed, they would return to the rhythm they'd built together, the long talks, the unplanned nights, the feeling that neither of them had to compete with the rest of the world for attention. So she waited, not with frustration, with faith, and for a while that faith was enough to hold the distance in place without letting it break. The distance didn't announce itself. It showed up in small, forgettable moments. Conversations shortened because one of them was tired. Plans shifted to another night that never quite arrived. Messages became updates instead of connection. When they did sit together, the silence felt different. Not uncomfortable, just thinner, like something that used to fill the space had stepped away without either of them noticing when. Chris often had his attention split, one part of him still somewhere else, thinking through problems, replaying decisions, preparing for what came next. He was present but not fully there. Tatiana noticed, though she rarely pointed it out. Instead, she adjusted again. She spoke less when he seemed distracted. She chose easier topics. She let moments end sooner than they used to. Nothing was wrong enough to confront. But something important was no longer being protected. And slowly, without conflict, the closeness they once relied on began to loosen. Over time, their talks lost their depth. What used to stretch late into the night, ideas, plans, small stories from their day, began to shrink into quick exchanges between obligations. Questions turned practical. Answers became efficient. How was your day? Busy? Did you eat? Nothing was harsh, nothing was cold, just brief. Chris often believed they would talk properly once things settled. He carried that assumption with confidence, certain that the connection between them was strong enough to pause without fading. But pauses, repeated often enough, start to feel permanent. Tatiana stopped saving certain stories for him. By the time he was free, the moment had passed. What once felt important no longer seemed worth reopening. Silence didn't replace their relationship. It thinned it. And without either of them deciding it, the space where their conversations used to live began to stay empty longer than it should have. The end didn't come with raised voices. It arrived on an ordinary evening. Chris had come home later than he promised. Again, not intentionally, just carried by the same current that had been pulling at his time for months. He expected the usual: quiet dinner, a few tired words, the assumption that tomorrow would be better. Tatiana was already packed, not dramatically, no scattered clothes, no rushed movement, just a small suitcase by the door, zipped and waiting. She stood beside it, calm in a way that made the moment feel settled long before he walked in. "I can't keep waiting for a life that never has room for me," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation meant to wound, just clarity. Chris searched for something to say, something that would slow her down, buy time, promise change. But every response sounded late, even in his own head. She didn't argue. She picked up the suitcase, paused long enough to meet his eyes, and then walked out. The door closed softly behind her, and just like that, the relationship ended the same way it had been fading, quietly, without a scene. In the days that followed, there were no dramatic messages, no long arguments, no attempts to reopen what had already been decided. Tatiana didn't leave to punish him. She left because staying had begun to erase parts of her she didn't want to lose: her time, her calm, the sense that her life could move forward instead of waiting in place. When she spoke to him once more, it was brief and steady. "I hope you build everything you're working toward," she said. "I just can't build it from the sidelines anymore." There was no bitterness in the words. If anything, there was care, quiet, respectful, final. Chris understood then that this wasn't a reaction to one bad night or one missed promise. It was the result of many small moments, adding up until the direction became clear. She wasn't leaving because she stopped caring. She was leaving because she cared enough about her own life to keep it moving. And that made it harder to argue with. The memory faded the same way it had surfaced, without warning. Chris found himself back in the cafe, the low hum of conversation replacing the quiet of that old apartment. The table in front of him was solid beneath his hands. Across from him, the boy was still talking, his voice steady and light. Tatiana listened, just as she had before. Nothing in her expression suggested the past was pressing against the present. She wasn't guarded. She wasn't distant. She simply existed where she was, fully anchored in the life she had built since then. Chris glanced down at the coffee in front of him, untouched. He wrapped his fingers around the cup, feeling the warmth that had been there the whole time, unnoticed. For a second he considered saying something, about the past, about the years in between, but the moment didn't ask for it, so he didn't. Instead, he let the silence sit naturally between them, no longer heavy, just honest. When he finally stood to leave, there was no dramatic goodbye, just a small nod, a quiet "I'll see you around," spoken without expectation. As he stepped back toward the door, the bell chimed once more. This time the sound followed him out, and for the first time since walking in, Chris carried something unfamiliar with him. Not regret, awareness. 2 weeks passed before Chris came back. At least that was what he told himself. The decision hadn't been planned. It arrived quietly at the end of a long morning when his schedule opened for the first time in days. His driver asked where to head next, and the answer came out before he examined it. Maple and 3rd. By the time the car stopped, he had already built a reasonable explanation in his mind. He was nearby. The coffee was decent. It was convenient. None of it was entirely true. When he stepped inside, the bell greeted him with the same soft note. The room felt unchanged, steady in a way that made his return seem less like an interruption and more like a continuation. His eyes moved instinctively toward the window. Tatiana wasn't there. Chris felt a brief, unexpected drop in his chest, small but noticeable. He told himself it didn't matter. He ordered anyway, took his coffee, and chose a seat that gave him a clear view of the door without making it obvious. He stayed longer than necessary, long enough to realize that he hadn't come for the coffee at all. 2 weeks passed before Chris returned. At least that was the version he repeated to himself. The morning had been heavy, with decisions, numbers, approvals, voices waiting on his answer. When the last meeting ended earlier than expected, his driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Office?" the man asked. Chris hesitated. For a second he almost said yes. That would have been the normal choice, the efficient one. Instead he looked out the window, watching familiar streets slide past. "Maple and 3rd, he said. The words came out calmly, as if they had been planned all along. The driver nodded. "The cafe?" "Yeah," Chris replied after a brief pause. "Just for a few minutes." By the time the car pulled over, he had already built a simple explanation in his mind. He was nearby, the place was quiet, he could take a call there if needed. None of those reasons were the real one. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The warmth met him first: coffee, baked bread, the low murmur of people who weren't in a hurry. The same calm from before settled around the room, unchanged, unbothered by his return. Chris's eyes moved toward the window without thinking. The seat was empty. He stopped for half a second, more affected than he expected. A barista looked up from behind the counter. "Morning. What can I get started for you?" "Black coffee," Chris said, then added, "Almost out of habit, please." "Coming right up." He waited, hands resting lightly on the counter, listening to the quiet sounds of cups and steam. When the cup was placed in front of him, he nodded. "Thanks. You're welcome," she said with an easy smile. "First time here?" Chris glanced toward the window again. "No," he answered. "Not exactly." He took the coffee and chose a seat that gave him a clear view of the door without making it obvious. From there he could see the entrance, the counter, the same table where Tatiana had sat before. Minutes passed. He checked his watch once, then set his phone face down on the table instead of opening it. A couple walked in, then a man in a suit, no one he recognized. Chris lifted the cup, took a sip, and realized he hadn't come for the coffee at all. He stayed anyway. Longer than necessary. Long enough to admit, quietly, without saying it out loud, that he was hoping the door would open again. Chris told himself it was coincidence the next time he came back. That visit happened 3 days later. This time he didn't wait for a gap in his schedule. He created one. Shift the noon call, he told his assistant over the phone. Move it to later. There was a brief pause on the other end. "That meeting's been locked in all week." "I know," Chris said calmly. "Just move it." When the call ended, he already knew where he was going. The bell chimed again as he stepped inside. The same barista looked up and recognized him with a small nod. "Back again?" Chris gave a polite half-smile. "Looks like it. Usual?" she asked. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Yeah." "Black." While she prepared it, Chris glanced toward the window. Empty. This time the disappointment didn't surprise him. He took his coffee and sat in nearly the same place as before. From here he could see the entrance clearly. Anyone walking in would pass directly through his line of sight. He told himself he was just taking a break. 5 minutes passed, then 10. A group of college students laughed near the counter. Someone dropped a spoon and apologized. The room carried on with its quiet rhythm. Chris checked his phone, opened an email, then closed it again without finishing. He wasn't here for work. The door opened. His attention lifted immediately, too quickly to hide. But it wasn't her, just an older couple stepping inside, shaking off the cool air. Chris leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, almost amused with himself. "You're wasting time," he muttered under his breath. Yet he didn't stand. Instead, he took another sip of coffee that had already cooled and stayed right where he was. Because somewhere between the first visit and this one, the truth had shifted. This wasn't coincidence anymore. He was coming back on purpose. Chris returned again the following week, this time later in the afternoon, when the light through the windows had softened and the cafe felt even quieter than usual. The bell chimed as he stepped inside. He barely had time to scan the room before a familiar voice cut through the low hum. "Hey!" Chris turned. Jaron stood near the counter, one hand resting on the edge as if he had been waiting for his order. His face lit up with easy recognition, the kind that comes without hesitation. "You came back," the boy said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Chris felt an unexpected warmth settle in his chest. "Looks like I did," he replied. Jaron nodded, satisfied, then pointed toward the window. "Mom's getting napkins. She'll be right back." Chris followed the direction of his finger. Tatiana stood a few steps away, speaking briefly with the barista. She hadn't noticed him yet. Jaron stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly as if sharing something important. "I told her you might come again." Chris raised a brow. "You did?" "Yeah," Jaron said simply. "You seemed nice." The honesty in it made Chris smile. Genuine, unguarded. "Thanks," he said. "I'll try to keep that reputation." Jaron grinned, clearly pleased with himself. At that moment, Tatiana turned. Her eyes met Chris's across the room. There was a brief pause, not tense, not awkward, just recognition settling into place again, softer this time. Jaron glanced between them, then announced with quiet pride, "See? I told you." Tatiana exhaled a small laugh, the kind that carried acceptance more than surprise. And just like that, Chris wasn't the man who had walked in weeks ago. He was someone expected. Tatiana took a step toward them, napkins still in her hand. "Chris," she said, her tone calm, neither surprised nor distant. "Tatiana." The exchange was simple, but it carried less weight than before, like something that had already settled during the time between visits. Jaron looked between them, satisfied that the introductions were no longer necessary, then returned to his drink as if the moment required no further supervision. "You've been coming here more often," Tatiana said. Chris gave a small nod. "Seems that way. Busy schedule finally giving you a break?" she asked, not sharply, just curious. "Something like that," he replied. "Or maybe I'm just learning to make one." She studied him for a second, measuring the difference between words and truth. Whatever she saw didn't alarm her. "That's new," she said quietly. Chris let out a faint breath that almost passed for a laugh. "Yeah, it is." There was no accusation in her posture, no protective distance. But there was awareness. She wasn't assuming anything. She was simply observing. Jaren slid his cup across the table, accidentally nudging it too far. Tatiana caught it before it tipped, her hand steady. "You okay there?" she asked him. "Yeah," he said, unfazed. Chris watched the exchange, the ease, the reflex, the way she returned her attention fully to the moment without effort. When she looked back at him, her expression had softened slightly. "You can sit if you want," she said, gesturing to the empty chair. "We're not in a hurry." It was practical, and somehow that made it feel more genuine. Chris pulled the chair out and sat, this time without hesitation. Jaren watched him with open curiosity, the way children do when they've already decided someone is safe but still want more information. "You work a lot," Jaren said suddenly. Chris blinked. "That obvious? You dress like my principal," the boy replied matter-of-factly. Tatiana pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. Chris glanced down at his tailored coat, then back at Jaren. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," Jaren said. "He's important." "Good to know," Chris replied, playing along. "I've always wanted to be compared to a principal." Jaren nodded, satisfied with the exchange, then reached for his backpack. "I drew something," he announced, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. He opened it carefully and turned it toward Chris. "This is our house." The drawing was simple, straight lines, a wide roof, 3 stick figures in front. Chris leaned in slightly. "That's solid architecture." Jaren grinned. "Mom says it's cozy. It looks like it," Chris said. Tatiana glanced at him, noticing the way he didn't rush the moment or turn it into a joke at the boy's expense. He treated the drawing like it mattered, because to Jaren, it did. "You good at drawing?" Chris asked. "I'm getting better," Jaren said confidently. "Mom says practice makes things easier." "That's true," Chris replied. "Works the same way with almost everything." Jaren seemed to consider that, then nodded like he'd just learned something useful. The conversation drifted into small topics: school, favorite breakfasts, whether pancakes were better with syrup or honey. Nothing heavy, nothing forced. Chris found himself relaxing into it without effort. For once, there was no performance required, no decision waiting on him, just a boy talking, and a table that didn't ask for anything else. Jaren slid off his chair a moment later. "I'm gonna get a cookie," he announced, already halfway standing. "Walk," Tatiana said gently. "I am walking," he insisted, then slowed his steps just enough to make it technically true. Chris watched him reach the counter, start a very serious conversation with the barista about which cookie was less crumbly. Tatiana followed his movement with her eyes until he was settled. Then she spoke. "He's adopted," she said quietly. Chris turned back to her, giving her his full attention. "I met him while volunteering," she continued. He didn't talk much at first, just stayed close, watched everything. There was no dramatic weight in her voice, just memory. "One day he asked if I was coming back the next week," she said. "I told him yes." A small smile touched her lips. "He started saving a seat for me after that." Chris glanced toward the counter, where Jaren was now carefully carrying a plate with both hands, concentrating like the task required absolute precision. "You changed his life," Chris said. Tatiana shook her head slightly. "He changed mine, too." The word settled between, and without needing emphasis. Chris studied her, not the way he used to, searching for what she needed, but with a quieter understanding. The steadiness he'd noticed before made sense now. This wasn't something she had stepped into casually. It was something she had chosen fully. Jaren returned, placing the plate down with visible pride. "No crumbs," he announced. "Impressive," Chris said. Tatiana smiled at the boy, then back at Chris, her expression open, unguarded, and for the first time, the picture in front of him felt complete. Not something temporary, something real. Chris leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes resting on Jaren as the boy broke his cookie in half with careful focus. There was a time when a moment like this might have stirred something sharper, questions, comparisons, the quiet urge to measure what could have been. That feeling didn't come. Instead, he found himself studying the ease between them, the way Jaren instinctively angled the plate so Tatiana could take a piece if she wanted, the way she thanked him like it mattered. "You're good together," Chris said, the words simple and unforced. Tatiana glanced at him, gauging whether there was anything beneath the statement. There wasn't. He makes it easy, she replied. Jaren looked up, mouth half full. I heard that. Chris smiled. You were supposed to. The boy nodded, satisfied, and returned to his cookie. Chris rested his hands on the table, feeling a quiet clarity settle in. Whatever place he once held in Tatiana's life wasn't something he could compare or compete with now, and strangely, he didn't want to. This wasn't about replacing anything. It was about recognizing what already existed. You did something good, he said to her. Tatiana held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small appreciative nod, not dramatic, just sincere. The air between them stayed calm, no tension, no guarded edges. The conversation tapered off without anyone forcing it to continue. Jaren focused on finishing his cookie, carefully brushing crumbs into a neat pile like it was part of the task. Tatiana sipped her coffee, her posture relaxed, one arm resting lightly on the table. Chris sat with them, hands loosely folded, no longer searching for something to say. The silence that settled wasn't awkward. It felt earned. A few months earlier, he would have filled the space, checked his phone, offered an update about work, steered the moment towards something productive. Now he simply stayed where he was, listening to the quiet sounds around them. Jaren hummed softly to himself while he worked on the last bite. Tatiana watched him with a faint smile that came and went without effort. Chris noticed how natural it felt to be included in a moment that didn't require him. No one was performing, no one was impressing anyone. They were just sharing the same table. After a while, Tatiana glanced at him. You don't look like you're in a rush, she said. I'm not, Chris replied. It was the first time in a long time that the statement was completely true. She nodded, accepting that without surprise, and returned her attention to Jaren. The quiet remained, steady, comfortable, unforced. And somewhere inside that stillness, the distance between them eased without either of them trying to close it. Jaren finished his cookie and wiped his hands carefully with a napkin, determined not to leave a mess behind. Can I show him my science project later? He asked Tatiana, nodding toward Chris like the decision had already been made. Tatiana glanced at Chris before answering, giving him space to decline if he wanted. If he has time, she said. Chris met the boy's hopeful expression and found himself answering without hesitation. I'd like that. Jaren's face brightened. It's about bridges. Mine holds 10 books. 10? Chris said, impressed. That's serious engineering. I used extra sticks, Jaren explained, proud of the strategy. That's usually how good ideas start, Chris replied. The boy nodded like he just received professional confirmation. Tatiana watched the exchange quietly. There was no push in her expression, no attempt to steer the connection, just observation, careful and patient. Chris noticed it. You've done a good job with him, he said softly. Tatiana shook her head a little. We did a good job with each other. Jaren leaned against her arm without thinking, comfortable, anchored. Chris felt something shift, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a steady warmth settling where tension used to sit. This wasn't about rebuilding what they once had. It was about discovering what could exist now, slower, simpler, without pressure. For the first time, being here didn't feel like revisiting the past. It felt like stepping into something new. Jaren gathered his backpack and began explaining in great detail how his bridge could hold more weight if he added support legs on the sides. His hands moved as he spoke, sketching shapes in the air. Chris listened, asking a question here and there, not to lead, just to understand. Tatiana watched them both, quiet, a small smile resting at the corner of her mouth. Moments like this didn't need anything dramatic, just time, just presence. Chris leaned back slightly, taking in the simple scene. The boy talking, Tatiana steady beside him, the soft rhythm of the cafe continuing around them. It struck him how rare it was to sit somewhere without being pulled in 3 different directions. If you've ever had a moment like that, one that seems small but somehow stays with you longer than the loud ones, you already know how powerful quiet connection can be. If this part of the story feels familiar, take a second to like the video so more people who need something steady like this can find it. Jaren finished his explanation with a proud nod. And that's why mine won't fall. Chris smiled. I believe you. Tatiana lifted her cup slightly, eyes warm, and without anyone announcing it, the 3 of them sat there, no rush, no pressure, just sharing a table that somehow felt more natural with each passing minute. The afternoon settled into that slow, comfortable hour when the cafe thinned out. Most of the earlier crowd had left. Chairs sat empty near the window, and the steady hum of conversation had softened into scattered voices that rose and fell without urgency. Chris arrived a few minutes before them this time. He chose a table without checking his watch, set his phone face down, and let himself sit without filling the space with emails or messages. The habit to reach for it was still there, but weaker than before. The bell chimed. Jaren walked in first, pushing the door open with both hands like it required effort. "I got here before you," he announced the moment he spotted Chris. "Looks like you did," Chris said, smiling. Tatiana followed behind him, brushing a loose strand of hair back as she stepped inside. When her eyes met Chris's, her expression held that same calm recognition. No surprise anymore, just familiarity. "You're early," she said. "So are you," he replied. Jaren dropped into his chair and immediately began unpacking something from his bag. "I brought the bridge," he said, placing it carefully on the table like it was fragile equipment. Chris leaned in. "This the upgraded version?" "Stronger," Jaren confirmed. "Way stronger." Tatiana sat across from them, watching the two with quiet attention. She didn't interrupt. She didn't guide the conversation. She simply let the moment unfold. Chris noticed something as he adjusted one of the small wooden supports on the model. No one here expected anything from him. No decision, no performance, no urgency, just presence, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, that felt like enough. After a few minutes of proudly demonstrating how the bridge could hold the weight of 2 stacked notebooks, Jaren looked toward the counter. "They have muffins today," he said, already halfway out of his seat. Tatiana raised a brow. And I should probably check if the blueberry ones are still there," he replied with complete seriousness. Chris hid a smile. "Walk," Tatiana reminded gently. "I am walking," Jaren said, then slowed just enough to prove his point as he headed toward the display case. He began studying the options like a careful inspector, hands behind his back, reading each label as if the choice required strategy. The distance gave the table a quieter space, not empty, just private. Tatiana wrapped her hands around her cup, letting the warmth settle into her palms. For a moment she watched Jaren, making sure he was fine, then her attention returned to Chris. The noise of the room faded into the background. No urgency, no pressure, just 2 people sitting across from each other with enough stillness to actually speak. Chris rested his forearms lightly on the table, posture relaxed in a way that would have felt unfamiliar months ago. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. It wasn't avoidance, it was timing. The kind that arrives when a conversation finally has space to be honest. Tatiana watched Jaren for another second, making sure he was fully absorbed in choosing between 2 muffins. Then she looked back at Chris. "You don't owe us anything," she said. The words were gentle, offered, not pressed. Chris didn't answer right away. There was no accusation in her tone, no hint that she expected something in return for the time he'd been spending with them. If anything, it sounded like permission, an open door he wasn't required to walk through. "I know," he said quietly. She studied his face, not searching for guilt, just checking for honesty. "I mean it," she continued. "You don't have to keep coming here because of the past." Chris held her gaze. "I'm not," he replied. The response was simple, but it carried weight. Across the room, Jaren finally chose a muffin and lifted it carefully like he'd secured something important. Tatiana followed the movement with her eyes, then returned her attention to Chris. The moment between them remained steady, calm, unforced. No one was trying to rewrite what had already happened. They were only acknowledging what existed now. Chris exhaled slowly, fingers resting against the edge of the table. "I know you waited," he said. The words weren't rushed. He didn't dress them up or soften them with explanations. Tatiana didn't interrupt. "You gave me more time than I ever admitted," he continued. "I kept thinking I'd fix the balance once things settled." A faint, knowing look crossed her face, not bitter, just familiar. "They never did," she said. "No," Chris agreed. "They didn't. There was no need to revisit every missed dinner or every quiet night that stretched too long. The truth sat between them without needing details. I thought pushing harder would buy us freedom later," he added. "I didn't realize what it was costing in real time." Tatiana's hands remained wrapped around her cup, steady. "I understood why you were working," she said. "I just couldn't keep living in the pause." Chris nodded once. "That's fair. No defense, no attempt to reframe the past, just acknowledgement, clear, direct, and late, but honest." Across the room, Jaren laughed at something the barista said, the sound light and unburdened. The contrast didn't sting, it clarified. Chris looked back at Tatiana. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. She held his gaze, then gave a small nod. Not absolution, not blame, just recognition that he finally did. Chris sat with the silence for a moment longer, letting what he'd said settle without trying to soften it. "I'm sorry," he said. Nothing followed, no explanation about pressure, no list of reasons, no attempt to prove he had meant well. Just the words, placed carefully and left alone. Tatiana didn't respond right away. She watched him the way someone does when they're deciding whether a statement is meant to close a conversation or finally tell the truth. You don't have to say that because you're here, she said quietly. I'm not, Chris replied. I'm saying it because it's true. Her expression shifted, subtle, but real. Not surprise. More like the release of something that had been held in place for a long time. I waited for that once, she admitted. I know, he said. No promise followed. He didn't try to turn the moment into a new beginning or a grand correction. The apology stood on its own. Across the room, Jaren was still carefully carrying his muffin back, both hands steady, focused on not dropping a single crumb. Tatiana glanced toward him, then back at Chris. Thank you, she said. It wasn't forgiveness offered dramatically. It was acceptance, quiet, measured, enough. And for the first time since they'd started talking about the past, the air between them felt lighter, not erased, just no longer held tight. Jaren reached the table and set the muffin down like he was completing a careful delivery. No damage, he announced proudly. Impressive handling, Chris said. Jaren nodded, satisfied, then focused on peeling the wrapper with full concentration. The brief interruption gave the moment space to settle. When the boy became absorbed in his task, the quiet returned, lighter this time. Tatiana looked at Chris, her tone calm but direct. You seem different. Chris didn't deflect. I am, he said, no attempt to dress it up, no claim that everything had changed overnight. I used to think being needed everywhere meant I was doing something right, he continued. Now I'm realizing I was just never anywhere long enough. Tatiana listened without stepping in. I'm not trying to fix what already happened, he added. I just don't want to keep repeating it. There was no urgency in his voice, only clarity. She studied him for a moment, measuring the difference between intention and habit. Consistency matters more than good intentions, she said. I know, Chris replied. That's what I'm working on. No promises, no dramatic declarations, just two people speaking plainly, without the old pattern of one explaining and the other waiting. At the edge of the table, Jaren broke his muffin in half and slid one piece toward Tatiana without looking up. Share, he said simply. She smiled and took it. The moment said enough. Honesty didn't need to be loud to change the direction of what came next. Chris watched Jaren carefully divide the muffin, making sure both halves looked equal before taking a bite. The small act carried no performance, just habit. He found himself noticing things he used to overlook, not because they were dramatic, but because they were steady, repeated, real. It struck him then that he wasn't sitting here to correct what had already been lost. Nothing he did now could rewrite the years that had passed or return them to who they were before. And for the first time, that truth didn't feel like pressure. It felt clear. I'm not here to fix anything, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Tatiana heard him anyway. Good, she replied. He looked up. Trying to fix the past usually breaks the present, she added, her tone gentle, matter of fact. Chris nodded once. I'm here because I want to be, he said. That's it. No grand intention behind it. No hidden agenda. Just choice. Jaren glanced up briefly. You're here because the muffins are good, he said with full confidence. Chris smiled. That too. The boy accepted that explanation and returned to eating. Chris leaned back slightly, letting the moment settle. For the first time since walking into this cafe weeks ago, he understood something with quiet certainty. He wasn't chasing what used to exist. He was deciding to stay where he was, fully, without dividing his attention, and that decision felt lighter than any promise he'd ever made. The conversation didn't end. It softened. Jaren finished his muffin and began explaining, with complete seriousness, how his teacher said bridges fail when the middle part gets lazy. He demonstrated with 2 pencils and a napkin, building a tiny example on the table. Chris leaned in, following the explanation like it mattered. So the support has to be here? He asked, pointing. Yeah, Jaren said. Or it bends. Tatiana watched the exchange, quiet, attentive, not stepping in, not guiding it. Her posture had shifted without announcing it. She wasn't measuring Chris anymore. She was including him. Can I see the upgraded version next time? Chris asked. Jaren nodded immediately. I'll make it stronger. Deal. Tatiana met Chris's eyes for a brief second. The look carried something new, not nostalgia, not caution, recognition that he wasn't just passing through. You've been consistent, she said. Chris didn't rush to respond. I'm trying to be. She gave a small nod, accepting the effort without praising it too quickly. The space between them felt different now, less like 2 people revisiting an old story, more like 3 people sharing the same one, slowly, without pressure to define it. Jaren pushed the pencil bridge toward Chris. Don't break it. I won't, Chris said, steadying it with one finger. Tatiana smiled faintly at the scene, the kind that comes when something begins to feel reliable again. not because of promises but because of repeated presence. Nothing dramatic had happened, and yet something had clearly shifted. Chris set the pencil bridge back on the table, careful not to disturb the small structure Jaren had built. For a moment he simply watched the two of them, Tatiana listening, Jaren explaining something new with the same earnest focus. It became clear in a way that didn't need words. This wasn't a second attempt at the life they once planned. That version had ended quietly years ago, and nothing happening here was trying to recreate it. There were no rushed gestures, no emotional shortcuts pretending time hadn't passed. What existed now was different, slower, more honest, built without expectations. Chris felt the shift inside himself, subtle but steady. He wasn't measuring what he'd lost anymore. He was noticing what was in front of him. Jaren looked up suddenly. "You're listening for real?" "I am," Chris said. The boy nodded, satisfied, as if that was the only requirement. Tatiana caught the exchange and held Chris's gaze for a brief second. There was understanding there, not of the past, but of the present. Nothing about this moment needed to be labeled. It just needed to be lived, and that realization changed the weight of everything that had come before. The afternoon light shifted across the table, inching slowly toward the window. No one rushed to leave. Jaren began packing his bridge back into his bag with careful hands, making sure none of the small supports bent. Tatiana gathered the empty cups, stacking them neatly to the side. Chris stayed seated, watching the simple routine unfold. There was a time when he would have filled this moment with plans, suggesting dinner, promising to call, outlining what came next. That instinct rose briefly, then faded. This didn't need to be pushed forward. It only needed to be continued. "You coming back this week?" Jaren asked, tightening the zipper on his bag. Chris glanced at Tatiana, then back at the boy. "Yes," he said. "I am." No flourish, no big declaration, just a clear answer. Tatiana held his gaze for a second, reading the difference between intention and habit. Whatever she saw, she accepted with a small nod. "Same time?" she asked. "That works," Chris replied. Jaren slung the bag over his shoulder, satisfied. "Good. I'll bring the stronger version." Chris smiled. "I'll be ready." They stood together, pushing chairs in, the movement uncoordinated but natural, 3 people leaving the table they'd shared without needing to define what it meant yet. As Chris stepped toward the door, he noticed something quietly certain settle inside him. He wasn't returning out of guilt. He wasn't chasing what used to be. He was choosing, deliberately, to show up again. And that choice, simple as it seemed, set the direction for everything that would follow. Monday morning returned with its usual pressure. Chris stepped into his office to find the day already stacked. Back-to-back meetings, 3 priority calls, and a presentation waiting for final approval. His assistant stood near his desk with a tablet in hand. "Your 9 o'clock move to conference room B," she said. "Legal needs 15 minutes before the board call." Chris set his briefcase down and looked at the schedule. Every block was filled. A month ago he would have nodded and started moving. One task rolling straight into the next, no gaps, no questions. Today he didn't. "Which of these actually needs me in the room?" he asked. His assistant paused, surprised by the question. "Most of them usually do. Usually isn't the same as necessary," Chris replied calmly. "Walk me through it." They reviewed the list together. As each item came up, Chris asked one simple thing. Who else can handle this? Operations could run the vendor call. Finance didn't need him for the preliminary review. The update meeting could be shortened or skipped entirely. Within 10 minutes, space began to appear where there had been none. His assistant glanced up. "You're clearing half your day. I'm clearing what doesn't require me," Chris said. There was no frustration in his tone, just precision. "What should I put in the open blocks?" she asked. Chris thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Leave them open." "Open, as in unscheduled?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, still adjusting to the shift. As she stepped out to make the changes, Chris sat down and looked at the quieter calendar on his screen. Nothing dramatic had happened. No major announcement. No speech about priorities. Just a series of small decisions that created something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Time that wasn't already promised away. He leaned back in his chair, noticing how unfamiliar that felt. Not uncomfortable, just new. Later that morning, Chris stepped into the operations meeting he usually led from the head of the table. The team straightened as he entered, laptops open, notes ready. Habit placed him in the central chair, then he paused. "Daniel," Chris said, nodding toward his operations director. "You run this one." Daniel blinked. "You want me to present the rollout?" "You've been managing it for weeks," Chris replied. "You know it better than I do right now." A few people exchanged quick glances. Chris almost never handed off control once he was in the room. Daniel hesitated. "You sure?" Chris pulled out a chair along the side instead of the head. "Completely." The shift was small, but everyone felt it. Daniel moved to the front, clearing his throat before starting. As he spoke, his confidence grew. Details came faster, decisions sharper. The team responded to him directly instead of looking to Chris for approval after every point. Chris listened without interrupting. Once or twice, someone turned toward him out of reflex. He simply nodded toward Daniel, redirecting the question back where it belonged. The meeting ended earlier than usual. As people gathered their things, Daniel approached him. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "I could have handled it." "I know," Chris replied. "That's the point." Daniel considered that, then gave a small, appreciative nod. Back in his office, Chris noticed something he hadn't expected. Nothing had fallen apart, no crisis, no missed detail. The work had moved forward, smoothly, without him steering every step. For years he had carried the assumption that being responsible meant being present for everything. Now he was starting to see the difference between leadership and control, and letting go, even a little, created more than efficiency. It created room. By midweek, the invitations started stacking up again. Strategy review, partner lunch, a networking dinner that had been on his calendar for months. Chris stood by his desk scrolling through the list while his assistant waited for instructions. "This dinner with Westbridge," she said, pointing at the screen. "They specifically asked for you." Chris read the note, then looked at the time. Thursday evening. The same evening he'd told Jaren he'd come by the cafe. He exhaled quietly. "Who else can represent us?" he asked. "Daniel could," she said. "Or Lisa." "Send Daniel," Chris replied. His assistant hesitated. "They might be disappointed." "Possibly," Chris said, "but they'll still get what they need." She nodded and made the change. Another notification popped up, an internal review that usually ran long. "Decline that one," Chris added. "You never skip those," she said before she could stop herself. Chris gave a small, knowing smile. "I used to attend everything just in case something needed me. And now I'm trusting the people I hired." She updated the calendar, the list shrinking with each decision. When she finished, she looked up. "You've got your evening clear." Chris glanced at the open space on the screen. It didn't feel like lost opportunity. It felt intentional. "Good," he said simply. After she left, he sat for a moment, aware that each declined invitation came with a trade-off. Less visibility, fewer chances to steer every outcome personally. For years that would have felt risky. Now it felt necessary, because for the first time, he wasn't measuring his value by how many rooms he occupied, but by the ones he chose on purpose. Thursday came without fanfare. Chris simply left the office on time. His assistant looked up as he passed her desk. "Heading out?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm done for today." She checked the clock, mildly surprised. It was earlier than his usual exit. "Everything covered?" she asked. "It is." He didn't explain where he was going. He didn't need to. The drive across town felt different when it wasn't squeezed between calls. The city moved at its normal pace, people crossing streets, storefronts closing for the evening, lights warming in windows as dusk settled in. When he stepped into the cafe, the bell greeted him with its familiar note. Jaren spotted him first. "You're on time," the boy announced, like it was an achievement worth celebrating. Tatiana looked up from her seat, a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes. Not surprise, not praise, just recognition. "Hi," she said. "Hi." No speech about rearranged meetings. No mention of what he'd declined to be there. He took the chair beside them like it was part of a routine already forming. Jaren pushed a small stack of books toward him. "Test the bridge," he said seriously. Chris placed one book on top, then another. The structure held. "Solid work," he said. Jaren grinned. Tatiana watched the exchange, her posture relaxed as if she'd been waiting not for promises, but for this. Chris realized something as he sat there, sleeves slightly rolled, attention fully on the table. Consistency didn't announce itself. It showed up, and then it kept showing up again. The first Saturday started without a plan. Chris woke earlier than usual, out of habit, and reached for his phone before remembering there was nothing urgent waiting. The quiet felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. By mid-morning, he found himself standing outside the small grocery near Tatiana's street, holding a basket he hadn't intended to pick up. Inside were pancake mix, eggs, and a bottle of syrup. He knocked once before the door opened. Jaren answered, hair still slightly messy from sleep. "You came early," he said, surprised but pleased. "I figured mornings are better for important projects," Chris replied, lifting the bag. "Pancakes?" Jaren asked, eyes lighting up. "Pancakes." From the kitchen, Tatiana called, "Who is it?" "Backup chef," Jaren announced. She stepped into view, pausing for half a second when she saw Chris, more taken off guard by the normalcy of the moment than by his presence. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said. I wanted to, he answered simply. A few minutes later, the kitchen filled with the soft sounds of batter being mixed in a pan warming on the stove. Jaren stood on a chair, responsible for stirring with intense concentration. Not too fast, Tatiana reminded. I know, he said, slowing slightly. Chris handled the pan, testing the heat with a small drop of batter. Professional, Jaren whispered, impressed. I've had practice, Chris said. The first pancake came out uneven. Jaren laughed. That one's yours. Fair, Chris agreed. By the third attempt, the shape improved. The smell filled the room, warm and familiar. They ate at the small table, nothing formal, just plates, syrup, and easy conversation that moved between school stories and weekend plans. No one checked the time. At one point, Jaren declared, Saturday pancakes should be a rule. Tatiana glanced at Chris, then back at the boy. That's a good rule. Chris nodded. I can work with that. It wasn't a grand moment, just breakfast. But as laughter slipped easily between them, it became something more. A routine beginning to take shape without anyone needing to define it. And routines, Chris realized, were built the same way trust was, by showing up again next week. The next Saturday, Chris arrived with only a small bag of groceries. No grand surprise. No attempt to outdo the week before. Just eggs, milk, and a fresh bottle of syrup because the last one was nearly empty. Jaren opened the door again, already smiling. You remembered. I said I would, Chris replied. This time the process felt smoother. Jaren climbed onto his chair without being told. Tatiana set out plates while Chris heated the pan, movements falling into place like they'd practiced them for years. Your flip is better, Jaren observed as the second pancake landed neatly. Repetition helps, Chris said. Tatiana glanced at him. That applies to more than cooking. I'm starting to notice, he replied. They didn't rush breakfast. Between bites, Jaren talked about a class project and how his teacher said he asked too many questions. That's usually a good sign, Chris said. Means you're paying attention. I am, Jaren insisted. After they finished, Chris stood to rinse the dishes without being asked. You don't have to, Tatiana said. I know, he answered. I'm already here. It wasn't a big gesture, just a small, steady one. No attempt to impress. No effort to earn credit. By the time he left, there were no promises about next time. No dramatic goodbyes. Just, same day next week? Jaren asked. Chris nodded. Same day. As he walked back to his car, Chris realized something that would have frustrated the version of him from a year ago. Nothing about this was intense. No sweeping changes, no dramatic declarations, just repetition. And that repetition, quiet, reliable, was doing more than any grand effort ever had. That evening, as Chris prepared to leave, Jaren ran ahead to grab his backpack from the living room. The front door stood half open, letting in the cooler air from outside. Tatiana stepped closer, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry. I need to be honest about something, she said. Chris nodded. Okay, I'm not looking for big promises, she continued. I don't need plans mapped out months ahead. Her tone stayed calm, steady, not defensive. What matters to me is consistency, she said. Showing up when you say you will, not disappearing when work gets loud again. Chris didn't interrupt. I'm not asking for perfection, she added. Just reliability. The words landed without pressure. They weren't a test. They were a boundary, clear and respectful. Chris met her gaze. That's fair, he said. You should expect that. She studied his face, searching for any hint of automatic reassurance or quick agreement meant to smooth the moment. There wasn't any. I mean it, he continued. If I say I'll be somewhere, I will. From the hallway, Jaren called out, I found my shoes. Tatiana's attention flicked briefly toward the sound, then back to Chris. A small nod followed. Not approval, not relief. Just acknowledgement that the expectation had been heard. Okay, she said. No emotional swell. No dramatic pause. Just a clear line drawn, and respected. Chris rested his hand lightly on the doorframe, considering her words before answering. I won't pretend I can control every emergency, he said. There will still be days that get complicated. Tatiana nodded once. I understand that, but complicated isn't the same as disappearing, he continued. If something changes, I'll say it. I won't just go quiet. There was no attempt to sound impressive, just a clear line he was willing to hold himself to. I'm not trying to promise everything will be smooth, he added. I'm just choosing not to vanish when it isn't. Tatiana watched him for a moment, weighing the difference between confidence and honesty. That's enough, she said. From down the hall, Jaren appeared, backpack slung over one shoulder like he was preparing for a trip. You leaving already? He asked. For tonight, Chris replied. Jaren frowned slightly. Next Saturday still happening? It is, Chris said. The boy accepted that answer and nodded, satisfied. Tatiana stepped back, giving Chris space to head out. The moment didn't carry any dramatic emotion, just a quiet understanding that expectations had been set and answered. As Chris reached for the door, he realized something subtle but important. He hadn't tried to win the moment, he had simply told the truth about what he could and would do. And that felt stronger than any promise he used to make too quickly. The next few weeks settled into a steady rhythm. Chris didn't announce his visits anymore, he simply arrived when he said he would. Saturday mornings meant pancakes or waffles, depending on Jaren's latest preference. Once, they attempted French toast and ended up laughing when the first batch came out too soggy to flip. Still edible, Chris insisted. Barely, Tatiana replied, amused. Jaren declared it science, and the second attempt came out better. On weekday afternoons, Chris stopped by the cafe when his schedule allowed. Sometimes he stayed 20 minutes, sometimes an hour. The length didn't matter as much as the fact that he came. One evening, Jaren struggled with a homework problem, erasing the same line 3 times. "It's not working," he muttered. Chris pulled the paper closer. "Show me how you're thinking about it." They worked through it together, slow, step by step, until the answer made sense. "Oh," Jaren said, surprised. That's it, Chris confirmed. The boy leaned back, relieved. "You explain stuff better than my book." "I'll take that as a compliment," Chris said. Across the table, Tatiana watched quietly. She didn't step in, didn't correct, just observed the patience in Chris's tone, the way he stayed present even when the process took longer than expected. Nothing about these moments was dramatic. No big declarations, no sudden changes, just repeated proof, showing up, listening, staying until things were finished. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It built the way routines do, through small actions that kept matching their words, and with each week that passed, Chris noticed something shift. He was no longer being observed to see if he'd disappear. He was being included because he hadn't. Jaren was already half asleep on the couch, curled into the corner with a blanket pulled up to his chin. The television played softly in the background, volume low enough not to disturb the quiet. Tatiana adjusted the blanket around him, brushing a hand gently across his hair before stepping back. "He fought sleep for 20 minutes, she said in a hushed voice. A faint smile crossed her face. They moved toward the door together, careful not to let it creak. The hallway light spilled in softly from outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no tension in the silence, only the calm that comes after a day that went exactly the way it needed to. "You've been consistent," Tatiana said at last. She studied him, not searching for promises this time, just acknowledging what had already been proven. Chris nodded once. "I said I would be." "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't turn it into a speech. "Lost the battle," Chris replied. One evening, after homework was finished and the dishes were drying on the rack, Chris stood by the doorway preparing to leave. "Of course," he answered. Behind them, Jaren shifted slightly but didn't wake. Chris stepped out into the night air, the door closing gently at his back. The street was calm, light steady, nothing pulling at him to rush somewhere else. As he walked to his car, he realized something that would have surprised him months earlier. Success still mattered, responsibility still existed, but neither of them owned all of his time anymore. For the first time in years, his life didn't feel like something he was chasing. It felt like something he was finally living, one steady choice at a time. The air warmed gradually, softening the sharp edge the mornings used to carry. Trees along the street outside Tatiana's building filled with new leaves, the kind that caught sunlight and held it. Chris noticed the change one Saturday as he stepped out of his car. Jaren was already outside, bouncing lightly on his heels. "You're late by 2 minutes, he declared, checking a plastic watch that was clearly set wrong. "Then I'll have to make up for it," Chris replied. "With pancakes," Jaren said immediately. "That seems fair." Spring arrived without announcing itself. Tatiana stood near the doorway, keys in hand, watching the exchange with a quiet smile. "You ready?" she asked Jaren. "I've been ready," he insisted. They started down the sidewalk together, the pace unhurried. The neighborhood felt different in the warmer light, windows open, distant laughter carrying from somewhere down the block. Chris walked beside them, hands relaxed at his sides. Nothing about the morning was dramatic, no milestone, no announcement, just a steady sense that something had shifted over time, like the season itself, without needing a single defining moment. Jaren kicked a small pebble ahead of him as they walked. "Are we going to the cafe after?" he asked. Tatiana glanced at Chris. "If that works," she said. Chris nodded. "It does." Chris slowed slightly, matching Tatiana's pace. For a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet between them no longer carried history. It carried comfort. They turned the corner toward Maple and 3rd, the cafe coming into view at the end of the block. Jaren spotted it first. There it is, he said, pointing like it had been a destination worth tracking all morning. The building looked the same, narrow windows, the familiar wooden door, the small bell visible through the glass. Nothing about it had changed. What had changed was how Chris approached it. The first time, he had walked in alone, pulled there by something he didn't understand. Now he walked beside them. Jaren moved a few steps ahead, then doubled back, unwilling to get too far from either of them. Race you to the door, he said. You'll win, Tatiana replied. I know, he said confidently, then jogged forward anyway. Chris watched him reach the entrance and grab the handle with both hands, waiting, this time, until they caught up before pulling it open. After you, Jaren said, holding the door wide. Tatiana laughed softly. Such manners. Chris stepped closer, pausing just outside for half a second. The last time he'd stood here, he'd been unsure whether to stay or leave. Now there was no hesitation. He nodded toward Jaren. Lead the way. The bell chimed as the door opened, and instead of stepping into a memory, Chris walked in beside the life that had grown while he learned how to be present enough to meet it. The bell's soft chime barely finished before Jaren slipped past them, already scanning the room. Window table, he called, spotting the open spot like it was a prize. He hurried over, then caught himself and slowed, remembering the rule, though the excitement still showed in the quick bounce of his steps. Chris and Tatiana followed at an easy pace. Jaren reached the table and turned, hands on the back of the chair as if guarding it. I saved it, he announced proudly. Impressive timing, Chris said. I've been practicing, Jaren replied with a grin. Tatiana set her bag down and brushed a hand over the tabletop, a familiar gesture that seemed to settle the space. The same window, the same light, but the feeling around it had changed. Jaren pulled his chair out and dropped into it, already looking toward the counter. Do they still have the chocolate muffins? He asked. We can check, Tatiana said. I'll come with you, Chris offered. I got it, Jaren said quickly, sliding off his chair. I know where they are. Walk, Tatiana reminded, smiling. I am walking, he insisted again, heading toward the counter with determined steps. Chris watched him go, a quiet amusement in his expression. The sound of Jaren's light footsteps, the low hum of the cafe, the sunlight resting across the table. It all carried an ease that didn't need effort. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Just the simple, unguarded joy of a boy who already believed this was exactly where they were supposed to be. As Jaren studied the display case with intense focus, the table grew quiet again. Sunlight rested across the surface, warming the edge near where Chris's hand lay. Tatiana shifted slightly in her chair, turning toward him. For a second, neither spoke. Then her fingers moved, hesitant only in the sense that the moment mattered, and rested lightly over his hand. It wasn't dramatic, just a gentle squeeze. Chris looked down, then back at her. There was no question in her expression, no demand for reassurance, only a calm recognition of everything that had changed between them, not overnight, not through promises, but through weeks of simply showing up. Funny, she said softly, how life brings you back when you're finally ready to stay. Chris held her gaze, the weight of the words settling without pressure. I think I had to learn how, he replied. Across the room, Jaren's voice floated back toward them as he asked the barista a very serious question about which muffin had the most chocolate. Tatiana smiled faintly at the sound, then looked at Chris again. There was no rush in the moment, no need to define what came next, just a quiet certainty that whatever this was now, it was built on something stronger than what they once had. Chris didn't pull his hand away. This time, he didn't hesitate. Jaren turned from the counter with a small plate in his hands, concentrating the way he always did when he didn't want to spill anything. I got the chocolate one, he announced as he walked back toward the table. Chris and Tatiana both looked up. Jaren set the plate down carefully, then glanced between them, first at Tatiana, then at Chris, as if checking that they had seen his success. You guys are slow, he said with a playful shake of his head. Tatiana laughed softly. We were talking about muffins, he asked. Something like that, Chris replied. Jaren slid into his chair, then paused, studying them again, this time with the quiet certainty children carry when something feels obvious. Mom, he said, nudging the plate toward Tatiana. She reached for it automatically. Then he looked at Chris. And Dad, do you want the bigger piece? The word landed without hesitation. No build-up, no doubt. Just said the same way he would say any other truth. Tatiana froze. Her hands stopped halfway to the plate, eyes shifting toward Chris, surprised, searching, unsure whether to correct the moment or let it pass. The cafe noise continued around them. Cups, low conversation, the steady hum of an ordinary day. Chris didn't react with shock. He didn't rush to fix it. He simply looked at Jaren, then at Tatiana, and let a quiet smile settle in. Sure, he said gently. I'll take the bigger piece. The tension eased. Jaren nodded, satisfied that the distribution was fair, and broke the muffin in half with careful attention. Tatiana exhaled slowly, the surprise in her expression softening into something warmer, something that didn't need to be named yet. No one corrected the word. No one explained it. The moment was allowed to exist exactly as it was, simple, unforced, and quietly significant. And for the first time, it didn't feel like something fragile. It felt natural. The moment didn't turn into a scene. Jaren focused on dividing the muffin as evenly as possible, satisfied once both halves looked the same. He pushed one toward Tatiana, the other toward Chris, then took a small bite from his own piece like the task had been successfully completed. Conversation in the cafe continued around them, ordinary, steady, unchanged. Tatiana's hand rested near Chris's again, not gripping, just close enough to feel the warmth between them. She glanced at him once, a quiet question in her eyes. Chris met her gaze. There was no confusion in his expression, no need to explain or retreat from what had just happened. The word hadn't felt like pressure. It had felt like direction. He picked up his half of the muffin and took a small bite, as if accepting the moment the same way Jaren had offered it, simply, without ceremony. Jaren leaned back in his chair, satisfied. See? Perfect split. Perfect, Chris agreed. Tatiana let out a soft breath, the last trace of surprise easing into a calm smile. She didn't correct Jaren. She didn't rush to define anything. She just stayed. Chris looked around the cafe, the same windows, the same light, the same bell above the door that had once marked a moment of hesitation. Now there was none. He wasn't standing at the edge of someone else's life anymore. He was part of what was unfolding, present, steady, and certain in a way that didn't require a promise to prove it. Jaren slid off his chair. Can we come here again next week? Chris glanced at Tatiana. She nodded once. We can, he said. No pause, no second guessing. Just an answer that matched the life he had been choosing, week after week. Outside, spring light rested against the glass, warm and clear. Inside, the three of them remained at the table a little longer, no rush to leave, no need to fill the silence with anything more. This time, when the moment settled, Chris didn't wonder whether he should stay. He already had. If this one stayed with you for a reason, take a second to let me know in the comments what part felt most real to you. And if you enjoy stories that value presence over noise, consider subscribing to Mr. Cooper Stories. There's more waiting for you here.